Thank you very much. So, Geraint, over to you.
Thank
I'm
you,
going to
Deborah,
try and.
for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored to speak to you and to actually find out more, hopefully, in the discussion later about your group and the interest you have in climate and what's happening to our world at the present time. I'm going to give you a talk about some of the work that we do, give you a context about why it's important to the way that our climate works as well. But what I'll also do is give you an insight into what it's like to do the job that we do, and the extreme lengths that we have to go to try and get some of the important measurements that need to be made. And I hope that sort of, interests you in some ways, from whichever angle you're looking at it. But it's not to speak on behalf of my team. I'm very proud of the team in which I work and the work that they're doing, and I hope I'll be able to convey at least some of the amazing things that they do. All right, so I'm going to try and share now. We've had a few technical snags. I'm afraid that the sound wasn't working. There are a couple of videos which it doesn't really need the sound. It just adds to the atmosphere. So I'll have to try and create that atmosphere with my voice, I'm afraid. Okay, I'm just going to share this now in full screen. Hopefully, Deborah Petra will tell me when it's coming through okay.
Yep, perfect.
Is that all right? Everyone seeing it full screen? Great.
Looks
Okay,
good to
thanks
me.
very much. All right, so you can see my title there is Changing Polar Oceans and Why Their Biology Matters to Us All. Now, I think if you're thinking about the polar regions, there's two things I think you probably know about. The first thing, of course, is the amazing penguins. In fact, this week there was a launch of the Penguin Book of Penguins, which actually is written by one of my colleagues in Bath. I do recommend that as a Christmas present. It's fantastic, and it was illustrated by his wife as well. So it is an amazing thing to buy. The other thing you probably know about polar regions is that we have a ship called Boaty McBoatface, and that hit the headlines several years ago now. A little bit of sort of egg on face in some ways, but not in others, because actually through that whole slight debacle, everyone knows that we now have a polar vessel, and we're very proud of it. It is an amazing vessel. It's been going now for about 2 or 3 years. It's called its official name is the Sir David Attenborough, and Sir David was actually very attentive during its whole construction, and was there at many stages when we were sort of putting the hull together and the superstructure and his first trials. He feels great ownership of the whole project, and we're very proud to have his name on the ship. So I'm going to talk to you about what we do on that ship, but also you can see another ship here on the bottom right-hand side, and that's the ship that preceded it. It was called the James Clark Ross, which was also an amazing ship. It went to the Ukrainians, actually. They bought it just before all the troubles, and it's still sailing in the Southern Ocean and doing fantastic work in its own right. But some of the work I'm going to show you is actually from my ventures on that vessel, because I was on that for about 20 years doing science. Okay, so this is what we're all trying to do in the type of work in our science is looking at these sort of graphs, and you might have come across this in your group of talking about what is the future of our climate. This is from a report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They bring reports out every few years, synthesizing what we know from all the scientists around about what's going to happen next to our climate, what we understand now, and what we think is going to happen next. And this is basically a synthesis, as I say. Everyone who really wants to contribute to climate change science tries to get a voice within this report. And what they come out with is very much our collective wisdom of what we think is going to happen next. Now, you see the graph there. It's sort of tracing our line from in black and gray up until the year about 2015 or so, and then projecting forward from there. And those you can see are several lines coming out of there. You might not come across this term. It's one we use widely in climate science, but these are shared socioeconomic pathways. And what they represent is what we think will happen next based on our levels of carbon emissions going forwards. And so the bottom line there, you see the SSP 1 to 1.9. That's a scenario where we try to adhere to all our objectives of reducing the amount of carbon that we are emitting, and the climate stabilizes to about 1 degree above what it was pre-industrial times. versus if you go to the top line there, the SSP 5 to 8.5, and that is what we call a business as usual, carrying on as we have done, not trying to limit our carbon emissions in any way. And you can see that's quite a frightening graph going about 4 to 5 degrees C above what we are now by the year 2100. So these are the things that we are projecting. None of them are the truth. And everyone who's in science regularly quotes the tale that all models are wrong and some are useful. These are models of what we think are going to happen next, but actually they are very useful when we're trying to make strategic decisions as a human population about what we're going to do. However, let me get to the point of this slide. What I want to say about this is that you see that there's lines and then there's like shaded areas around those. And those are where we have levels of uncertainty around what's going to happen next. And that uncertainty is because we haven't made enough measurements and we don't quite know where in the range the true measurements are. And so what we try and do in climate research, at least the people who are going out and trying to make the measurements, at least to help these models become more and more refined and accurate, is to make the measurements that they are lacking. And what I'll try and convey to you today is actually the real important part that the poles play in reducing the uncertainty we have about what happens next. So let me just take you on a journey about where we're going to go. So this is our itinerary. This is what we get at the regular start of our science journeys, as an itinerary of what we intend to do. It doesn't always work out the way we intend. But anyway, we'll start about why the poles matter and their biology, particularly because I am a biological oceanographer, so I'm really into the biological aspects, which is actually possibly the most important part. And what do we actually do? How we win our data. And I use that word very, very carefully because actually trying to get this data is really hard. And so when we do get data, it does actually feel like a win. And what's the future? I know you guys are talking all about how we minimize our carbon impact. That's very, very important also in how we do science. Trying to take the ship into the polar regions is a very carbon intensive process. There's ways that we can try and offset that by not using fossil fuel, but using hydrogenated vegetable oil, but still, it's still a very carbon expensive process. So how are we trying to do the future science, getting the measurements we need, but minimizing our carbon impact? And I thought that might be really relevant to your group. Okay, why the poles and their biology matter to us all. Well, what I need to do is before I get to the poles, I need to put the whole ocean into perspective, because actually the poles are part of a global, what we call an ocean conveyor. Now, the ocean itself has absorbed about 30% of all CO2 that we've generated since the Industrial Revolution, and 90% of all that heat that we've generated. All of that has gone into the ocean. And it might not be a surprise to you that actually the way we're going at the moment, the last 6 months or the first 6 months of this year were the second hottest on record. And the only one that was hotter than that was the year before, 2024. So we are on a trajectory already showing evidence of warming up. And what I can say is that that situation would be a lot worse if it wasn't for the moderating influence of the oceans. And much of that is thanks to this ocean conveyor. So when heat comes into this Earth, it mostly comes into the equator regions. That's where most heat is absorbed into the oceans. But then it's moved polewards and actually dissipated through the rest of the global ocean until it gets to what we call the polar nodes. And that's where it gets recirculated back again. And this really vital part that these polar regions are doing this recirculation, this reconvection of the waters back to keep this system of going from the hot to the cool. So we're sort of stopping these hot regions getting even hotter. So let's drill into the polar regions and see exactly what's happening there. And this is a bit of a complicated diagram, but I'll go through it. What I want you to imagine in your heads when I'm describing this is going on one of those travelators that you go in an airport, where you go in a long, huge corridor, and there's like this moving belt that you can get on with your suitcase. And right at the end of that belt, it goes underneath and then returns underneath your feet. That's exactly what's happening at the poles. So this warm water is coming into the polar regions. And what's happening there then is that you can see there's ice on this picture. And what the ice is doing is that it's taking out the fresh water and leaving cold, really, really salty, dense water. And what happens to that is that it goes really deep down, right to the bottom of the ocean, and then starts heading back north again. This same process happens almost symmetrically in the Arctic as well, but this is the Southern Ocean here, so it's going north again. And so that is creating this conveyor belt of this keeping this whole ocean conveyor moving. Now, the really good news for the planet on this is that once this water goes deep, it's taking with it, A, it's taking the heat from the system and locking it down into the deep ocean. And B, it's taking lots and lots of carbon dioxide into the deep ocean. And the second good news story about this is that actually, as it's traveling north in the deep layers, it's staying there for decades to potentially a century or more before it comes back to the surface again. So it's locking away some of this thing, some of these elements that it's captured from the atmosphere as it is now. Now, it eventually will come back to the surface again. It will lose some of that heat. It might even lose some of that carbon dioxide. But what it will bring up to the surface is lots of nutrients. And that is the second part of the story for the polar regions, is that they are incredibly productive. And that's why they're so, when you see the nature documentaries, there's so much life there, because this is where nutrients are fueling huge amounts of biological activity. And I'll come on to that a little bit. This is actually, from my perspective, this is how the world really works from an oceanographic perspective. You have right in the middle of that is Antarctica, because that is driving all these other ocean conveyors going off into other regions. So if you just focus on that red ring going around the Antarctic in a clockwise direction, that is called the Antarctic circumpolar current. So whereas all these other currents, they have to negotiate all these land barriers, this is uninterrupted. It keeps going round and round and round Antarctica and has incredible strength. This is the strongest current in any of our oceans. In fact, when we measure strength, we have the unit called a svedrup. Now, you probably don't know that unit, but just to give it some context, the largest river in the world, arguably, is the Amazon. One svedrup is 5 times the output of the Amazon. The amount of svedrups that goes round Antarctica is 135. So with my maths, that makes it 675 Amazon rivers going around the Antarctic continuously. That's how strong that current is, driving the currents in the rest of the global ocean as well. The other bad news for me is that that also makes it one of the stormiest, if not the stormiest ocean in the global ocean. So whenever we go and do field work in the Antarctic, we have to suffer quite a lot of storm activity. And so it takes quite a lot of strong sea legs to stand these Antarctic storms. Now, this is another perspective on our globe. This is a false color image of what the color of the ocean is viewed from space. So what this is actually revealing is where there is lots of greenness in the surface of the ocean. That greenness is created by tiny single-celled or multi-celled plants, algae called phytoplankton. And where there's more of these, there will be a greener color for it in the ocean. And so in here, you can see the green going to the yellow. Where it's really red, there's tons and tons of this phytoplankton right at the surface of the ocean. And that's fueled, as you can see in the polar regions, it's really, really strong there because, as I've already said, there's lots of nutrients coming up from the deep parts of the ocean, fueling lots of plant activity, lots of photosynthetic activity. But also noticeable is that there's lots of blue areas, particularly in these sort of subtropical regions. And that reveals areas where there's a starvation of nutrients. There isn't enough nutrients around to actually get things to grow. So that's what this reveals, is actually the polar regions are really, really productive, and it's not the same story everywhere. And that's, again, why it's so vital for us. And phytoplankton really are the heroes of our story about how the biology of the oceans affect us all. On the left-hand side here, you can see some microscopic images of some typical phytoplankton there. And here's a couple of buckets that I just took a photo of when I was in the Southern Ocean a few years back, just showing how deep green these tiny organisms are and how they pigment the ocean. And what they do is that by photosynthesizing, they're doing an amazing job for us. They are pulling the CO2 from the atmosphere. They're creating a gradient across the surface of the ocean because they are using in their photosynthesis. Remember back to your O-level GCSE on biology that photosynthesis is using carbon dioxide, combining it with light to create organic matter and releasing oxygen. And this gradient of CO2 is pulling in lots and lots of CO2 into the ocean, out of the atmosphere. And we don't want it to stay in the atmosphere, of course, because that's where it's acting as a greenhouse gas. But the other thing that it does is in the process of doing photosynthesis is that it's releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. And 80% of all the oxygen that we breathe comes from phytoplankton in the ocean. So they're absolutely vital to our planet. But the other thing that phytoplankton do is that they are the base of a very productive food chain in the polar regions. These are the virtual grass or vegetables that we get on land. Everything ultimately relies on phytoplankton at the base of the food chain. They're fed on by tiny things as well called zooplankton, but then fed on by gradually larger and larger organisms until you get to the largest organisms on the planet. The whales are feeding on 2 or 3 layers up from this base of the food chain of phytoplankton. They're feeding on things like krill and copepods. But there's lots of other biodiversity in the polar oceans. In fact, 30,000 species have been described in both poles so far. And that actually isn't that many when you think about the diversity of, say, places like the Amazon, for instance. But what it does have is many, many different types of habitats. It has like the deep ocean, lots of thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. They have sea ice that goes back and forth on a seasonal basis. On land, you have tundras, you have things called nanotux, which are isolated islands of rock with a little bit of soil. Incredible diversity of habitats and a huge diversity of animal life that actually inhabits those. The other thing to emphasize, though, is that in these habitats, as much as you think of them as extremely cold, the actual range in temperature is very small. Now we think about, the temperate climate in which we live, we can get somewhere between 0 degrees in the winter to about 20, 25. So a range about 25. It could be a little bit more in somewhere like continental Canada, maybe a range of 40 degrees. In polar environments, the temperature change is just about 4 or 5 degrees C between summer and winter. So it's very stable. And the problem that these animals have is that they've adapted to a very narrow range of temperatures. And the polar regions are some of the most rapidly warming climate regions on the globe. And so these animals are being pushed outside of what they are adapted to. And that's one of the critical things that's facing the biology of the Southern Ocean and also the Arctic at the moment, is that the warming is going at such a fast pace, it might be beyond the adaptive capacity of these animals to keep up. So let's go back to this model because there's something I just want to go back and emphasize here. So this is basically how, from a biologist perspective, this is how the polar oceans work. That you have nutrients that upwell, as already said. There's also lots of nutrients that come in from glaciers and rivers in the polar regions, and that fuels a really productive ecosystem. And that ecosystem is drawing in carbon dioxide and pumping out loads of oxygen. And in the process of trapping that carbon dioxide and making organic matter, carbon-based matter, a lot of that carbon gets pumped into the deep ocean. And I've already told you about the physical mechanism of this recirculating amount of water that's coming in from the equator and going down into the deeper parts of the Antarctic and Arctic. There's also biological mechanisms that pump this carbon deep down, sequestering is the word we use, sequestering this carbon into the deep ocean. I'm going to talk about some of those biological processes because they could be even more important than this physical process I've already mentioned. So let's go on to the second part of the talk, how polar ocean biologists win their data. And I'll just start with my organization, the British Antarctic Survey. We are the hub of at least British scientists, and many European scientists take advantage, as many other international scientists as well, of our logistics to get from the UK base, which is in Cambridge, is where I am now, all the way to our various Antarctic bases. And you can see actually there's lots of lines that are either planes or ships hopping down through either South America or Africa, various staging posts before they then venture into our bases. And there's two bases I wanted to notice. We just zone in on the Antarctic. There's a base called Rothera, which is our main hub there, and another one called Halley. And if some of you have seen some really good documentaries on the fact that we had a base on Halley, which was the wrong side. It's on an ice shelf. It was on the wrong side of a crack that developed in that ice shelf, and they had to try and move it so it was on the right side of the crack and didn't get carved off and go off into the sea. They did a fantastic effort of doing that. But we have lots of other bases on islands. Bird Island is on South Georgia. There's the South Orkney Islands where we have a base called Sydney. And also we do a lot of work out of the Falkland Islands as well. For me, the way I would normally get down is to fly through South America via Madrid mostly and hop all my way down to the tip of South America until the ship that I normally take is there, or we go to the Falkland Islands and catch it from there. And that normally takes about 2 or 3 days logistics to even start my voyage. And then to get to our destination of where we want to sample will take another week. So before I do any science at all, it's taken me about 11 days to even get there. So our voyages are quite long to actually do, the logistics, to get to the sampling site, to spend enough time there to get the measurements and get back again. I'm quite often away for 6 weeks, sometimes 2 months. It's a little bit easier in the Arctic. You can actually just leave from a British port and be in Arctic waters within 2 or 3 days. And that's becoming far more important now as we see that the ice in the Arctic is rapidly retreating. In fact, there are some predictions that the Arctic could be ice-free as early as 2030. I mean, ice-free in the summer. Of course, it will come back in the winter time. And that could mean a lot of things in terms of the way that the world works, the way that geopolitics works, because if that's now navigable, that could mean all sorts of things to us. But so we're doing a lot of research in the Arctic now to look at the consequences of this rapidly retreating ice on the North Pole. So I'm going to take you on a typical voyage that I would do. I'm just chosen this particular voyage, which is, we give it the name JR274. That's the 274th expedition that happened on the James Clark Ross I showed you at the start. And this is a typical science party. You can see that we're all shapes and sizes. We're young and old. These are some of the most experienced ocean scientists on the planet coming to do their research, wrapped up as they are. This is the Falkland Islands where we took this picture. It gets a lot more cold than that as soon as we start going south from there. So there's 33 scientists, and we come from 8 different institutes, some of them from the UK, some from Spain and France. This is a mostly European, although we do have a Chinese researcher there as well. And just to give you an idea of the types of people that we take, I'm sure you won't be familiar with a lot of these types of disciplines, but just to show you that we are called what we call multidisciplinary. We're not just doing all one thing to study it. We're trying to look at all different aspects of the Southern Ocean when we're doing this. And just to run through some of those things. So there's people looking at primary production, for instance. They're looking at these nutrients that I talked about. Trace metals. These are people who are trying to trace where the fresh water from melting glaciers and retreating sea ice, where that's going. And also people looking at the carbon going into the deep ocean. And then if you look on the right-hand side, these are sort of the biological people going all the way from the tiniest things that you can study the bacteria. And we got as far as zooplankton. There were no whale biologists on this one, unfortunately. We do regularly take whale biologists more and more now, but not on this particular expedition. So that's those are the science staff, but then on the bottom there we then have science support staff that help us in the labs. We also have the ship's officers and also the ship's crew. So we have a total complement on the ship that was 64 people. So that was the total number of people we'll be seeing for the next 2 months. And this is what we were going to try and do on this particular voyage. We always have a different mission. Sometimes we try and keep it some consistency, but this was a very specific mission that we went for this expedition. And we were looking at a process called ocean acidification. Now, I already talked about the fact that the oceans draw in loads and loads of carbon dioxide into the ocean. And that's great. And it takes it out of the atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas. It absorbs heat more than oxygen and nitrogen does. And so warms our atmosphere. So taking it out of the atmosphere is a good thing. But it comes at a cost. And one of those costs is that when you draw carbon dioxide into the water, it creates carbonic acid, and that lowers the pH of the oceans. And the oceans are generally alkali, they're not acidic. They have a pH of about 8 to 8.5. But lowering the pH of the oceans has consequences to a number of organisms, particularly those organisms that build their shells out of calcium carbonate, out of chalk. Because the more acidic you make an ocean, or less alkali, shall I say, the more it might corrode those shells. And on the right-hand side, you can see the global distribution as it is in the last few years. The projections are not that great, I'm afraid. But you can see where there's the greatest, the colors there represent the fact that as you get colder and colder into the blues and purples, the waters are becoming more and more corrosive to a form of calcium carbonate called aragonite. Aragonite is one of the forms of calcium carbonate. There's also calcite. And so as you get to the polar regions, because they're absorbing so much CO2 and because also it's quite cold, it's getting to a point where it's becoming corrosive. So as soon as it gets purple, it goes below 1 on that scale. That's when those things that have calcium carbonate will start to dissolve. And there's many, many organisms that we rely on that do a lot of that important heavy work of photosynthesizing that have calcium carbonate. So this is an existential problem, the acidification of the oceans. So we wanted to know more about this. And just to emphasize that point, going back to these shared socio-economic pathways, the y-axis here is not temperature, but it's the acidity of the ocean. So starting from about 8, if we carry on that worst trajectory there, we could be getting very close to the point where the oceans become even below 7, which is the point where it becomes acidic rather than alkali. And that already, if you're getting into some of the 7.9, 7.8 territories, that's becoming very, very detrimental, particularly to, well, not just calcium calcifiers, but also many other organisms in the ocean. So this was our expedition. We started off from the Falkland Islands this time, and we wanted to cover quite a range of environments on this expedition. So going from the blue areas there into the red. So these false color images, the more warm the color, the more productivity, the more phytoplankton activity there is. So we want to go to areas where there's lots of phytoplankton and also areas where there is a lot less. We wanted to go across these latitudinal gradients because I just showed you a plot that the further north and south you go, the more acidic the oceans become. And also we wanted to go in and out of the ice because those are very different environments which also have their own effect on the pH of the ocean. So we want to cover all these areas. So there's enormous amount of distance. That's why we have to go on such long expeditions. And all those dots there are places where we stopped and we did various measurements. And I'm going to show you the types of measurements that we take at those dots as we go through the rest of this presentation. So that was our plan. In fact, that was what we realized. Our plan looked a lot prettier than that. That looks quite ugly, doesn't it, as a cruise track, but that quite often is happening because of the storms and the ice and everything else. So it's not always straightforward as you plan when you leave the UK. And here we are. I do apologize, there's no sound, but I'm taking you now as we've just left the Falkland Islands going into these stormy seas. There were sound effects of roaring seas coming through here. So I'm going to take you through a storm that we were in. This was on, as I said, on the James Clark Ross. There's the master there taking the helm because it's getting so stormy as we're going through this ocean. And now we've reached the ice. We're going into the ice. It's not an icebreaker. It's ice strengthened, but it can actually negotiate quite extensive ice flows. And you can see going in there at about 5 or 6 knots. It knows it can actually cope with that type of ice as we're trying to get to some stations a little bit further in. And there we go. That's into the ice. So we can sample in those environments as well. So I said I'll show you some of the instruments that we use to try and take these really, really crucial measurements. And this is one of the key instruments. This is actually a water bottle sampler. We call it a Niskin bottle. And what we do with this is that we lower it to certain depths of the ocean. That we send a messenger, which is basically just a weight that we send down the string that it's attached to. And as it goes down the string and then gets to the bottle itself, it goes into a trigger, which then seals the cap. So you can see those two rings at the top and the bottom. They then spring and close off that water bottle. And so whatever it is in the water depths, it could be really shallow or really deep, it just captures that body of water, and then we bring it back to the surface and do the analysis. And we've done it here because there was a certain reason we had to do it one by one for this particular scientist. But quite often what we do is we put loads and loads of these water bottles onto something called a CTD. And I'm just going to show you a video. This is a CTD here. You can see there's loads of these water bottles on there, but also hidden behind those water bottles are many, many sensors measuring the properties of the water as it goes from the surface all the way down to the seabed, which could be as deep as 3.5, even possibly 4,000 meters in the Southern Ocean. So it's measuring temperature, salinity, the color of the ocean, amount of oxygen, the pH. Is measuring many, many other parameters beyond that as well as it's going and getting these vertical profiles, because there are many layers in the ocean, just like a cake, and we want to measure the properties of each of those layers in the ocean. So I'll just show you a video of it being deployed, and then I'll talk you through that. There's a funny moment where it looks like we're passing through a wall like a ghost, but actually that's a door that we're going through there, and we're going to see it coming out the other side onto the deck itself. So this is actually the Sir David Attenborough. That's what we're on now, watching this deployment going in. Those are the very hard-working deck crew that are doing that. And that will then be deployed. It's gone down to the bottom. They're bringing it back in again. They're fishing it out, making it secure, and then bring it into what we call the hangar. So they're just going to secure it now and then drag it into an area where it's nice and dry and shielded a little bit from the elements, where we can start sampling all the water it's collected at various depths in the ocean and actually start downloading the data as well. So there's my team. You can see they're busying around, and there's actually a very specific order in which they sample those water bottles, because when you're trying to get various bits of chemistry and properties of that water, if you do one before the other, sometimes you contaminate it. So you have to be really careful. You can see there's somebody there, if you be eagle-eyed with a clipboard, just making sure that the right person is going in at the right time. There's somebody washing one of their bottles before they actually start filling it to take one of their measurements. And now we've taken this water back into our lab, where we do all the other things that we need to do next now to measure the properties. We're filtering things down. We're looking at the particles in the water, all that carbon that we want to see where it is. The tiny microorganisms, the bacteria, the phytoplankton, all that's been done on these various filtering apparatus that the team are busying around here. And that will take them, quite often when the CTD comes up, that will be about 6 or 7 hours work just to prepare the samples ready to come home back to Cambridge, where we can do the analyses. And there they are. There's some of those filter rigs. You couldn't really see them from the video I saw there, but they basically pour the water really carefully through these filters and then collect the filters that's distilled that water. And you can see other people then putting those samples on the bottom right-hand side into some really cold conditions to freeze them and bring them all the way back to the UK, where we can do the measurements. There's also, on this particular expedition, we wanted to measure things in really clean conditions. So rather than going into the lab I just showed you, we have these things called clean containers, where we have absolutely zero contamination, because the things they want to measure are actually so minute in the levels of concentration that they have to be meticulous to not introduce anything else. Particularly when you things like that are really important to phytoplankton, that are really limiting the ocean. Iron in particular dictates a lot of where phytoplankton can be really prosper and where it really struggles. If there isn't enough iron in the water, then that actually means that it can't really photosynthesize very effectively. And these guys are trying to measure the level of iron that's in the water from these various bottles that they've taken off the CTD and brought into the clean container. And there they are. There's another experiment here, where in this particular, because it's an ocean acidification experiment, they got various water bottles that has taken water from various parts of the water column, and they put different levels of acidity in them just to see how they respond in terms of their level of productivity, whether they start dissolving those things with the calcium carbonate in their shells, just to look at the effects and what level does it become too corrosive, or does it affect other properties of these really, really tiny organisms in the water. That's what they're doing there. what I was working on, what I really love are things called zooplankton, and you can see me there. I'm that on the left-hand side is one of the nets that we use. It has a number of nets on there, and what we do with that is similar to the CTD water bottles. We send this net system really, really deep, and on the way back to the surface, we open and close a number of nets. There's actually 9 nets hanging from that frame, and that's me wrangling the frame there in front of it with those red bottles. That's actually where it all funnels down and we get the catch in those bottles. So there's 9 bottles on that frame there, and you can see the conditions are not that favorable. That's what we have to put up with in the Southern Ocean. And that beautiful thing you see on the right-hand side, that's actually called a sea butterfly. So it's related to the things that you see in your garden, slugs and snails. It's a mollusk, but rather than having that pedal foot to go along the floor, it's converted them into wings. And it has quite an ungainly way of flying around, as you can see, but it's incredibly abundant. So it must work as a body form that works well in the oceans. The problem that this organism has is that, as I was talking about calcium carbonate, it has a carbonate shell, and when the waters become less alkaline, when this becomes corrosive, these shells start to get dissolved, which could be a real problem because these are a very important part of this ecosystem that I'm talking about in the polar oceans. So we did some experiments, but also naturally already in the polar oceans, we were finding evidence that these shells were starting to dissolve. And these were us doing some experiments where, again, like we were for the phytoplankton, we put some different levels of acidity in these bottles and incubated them for a while just to see how things were faring in terms of how their shells were. And here were some of our results. This is actually a scanning electron microscope, just showing you the outside of the pteropod there. And you can see this surface damage, this where this purple arrow is going. That's where the waters were already corrosive and starting to dissolve the shell. And that wasn't good news because that even wasn't from an experiment. That was actually from the natural water column. We were finding shells were already starting to dissolve because in certain pockets, not everywhere, but in certain pockets of the Southern Ocean, we were finding that the waters were already becoming so acidified they were becoming corrosive to organisms like this. Okay, so let's go on to the third part of how we are trying to at least make these measurements in a better way, but also in a way that reduces our carbon footprint, because there have been some mini revolutions in the way that we do our science that I just want to bring to your attention. The first thing is that we can do a lot of the science, not everything, but a lot of our science now with the fantastic new satellites that we can put up in the sky to measure various properties, mostly of the surface of the ocean and also where the ice is, because actually the satellites give us lots of various measurements like the height of the ice and where it is, the distribution of it in real time, always in a very, very extensive way, all the way across the Southern Ocean. And those satellites in particular, Cryosat 2 and ISAT 2, have been around for more than a decade now and got a fantastic time series of what's happening to the ice. Now, the example I've given you here is actually of an iceberg that hit the news. I was given quite a few interviews in the time. This was during COVID, actually. This happened where it broke away. As you can see right at the bottom, some left-hand side, it broke away from the Larsen ice shelf, and the satellites could track it as it moved its way through the ocean all the way to almost getting to South Georgia. You can see it just touched the edge of what is the shelf area around South Georgia there. And that was because we didn't know what was going to happen next. There was these predictions that it could go all the way and go into the coast of South Georgia. That was never realistic for us as scientists, but the press made a big deal of that. And you can see that actually on a collision path to South Georgia is how BBC News relayed it. It never actually really happened, and we never thought it would. But it was good to get the publicity anyway, because again, it focuses people's minds on the fact that there are changes happening. There are a greater frequency of these icebergs, it seems now, in the Southern Ocean. And part of that is because some of these ice shelves seem to be carving off more than they have in previous times. And this is another way of looking at the legacy of what it happened. There's other types of satellites there, the soil moisture active, passive satellite. There's also the aqua satellite that can tell you properties of the ocean, at least the surface. And you can see on the top plot there is actually the saltiness of the ocean. We can tell that from space. And we've already seen images of the chlorophyll, the color of the ocean from space as well. So this gives us really good insights to some of these changes as they're happening. And so more and more, we're not quite armchair oceanographers, but there definitely is a strand of oceanography now which is just dealing with satellite data. So at least from not having to get all your data from sending ships to the polar oceans, that's good news, particularly in terms of a carbon perspective as well. And we can see another use of these satellites in looking at sea ice extent. On the top left-hand side, you can see how the seasonality of the sea ice pans out. So it gets to a minimum in the Antarctic in about February or March and goes to a maximum in October, November. And what we were finding there was actually the amount of ice that was happening in 2023 was a lot less than we'd seen almost for the past 20 or 30 years. So it was quite an anomalous year. And what they were fearing here was that what we could see from space, we could actually have a resolution that's high enough now to actually resolve emperor penguins and colonies. And on the bottom left, you can see it ringed. That is an emperor penguin colony during the period of its life cycle where it's crashing, where the chicks have got to that downy phase that you can see on the top right-hand side there. Those feathers that they have are not waterproof. They're not capable of swimming at that point. And what needed to happen is that ice needed to stay around until about January or February so that those individuals could actually develop those waterproof feathers that they needed to swim away and start their life at sea. And because of this really, really low sea ice year in that particular year, what happened was that those we were seeing from satellites, at least we could see that those sea ice areas were starting to retreat far faster. Unfortunately, it was before those particular colony could get beyond its crash phase, and so it was actually a mass mortality event, which was really sad. But at least we can evidence that just to show people and bring home those people who want to engage in different ways. But actually, it's affecting all sorts of things that we really care about, and that's what happened. That there were thousands of deaths of emperor penguins as a result of that. Problem with satellites is that it can tell you what's on the surface of the ocean. It's really good at resolving sea ice, as we've seen, but it can't tell you what's going on underneath. And some of the most interesting things that we want to know, particularly for those models that I talked about, what they're really, really bad at is actually knowing what's happening with sea ice and knowing what's happening underneath sea ice. Trying to get that right in models is one of the biggest problems that we have. So we still need observations from things that are physically there, measuring things underneath the ice. Now we can do that with a ship. I've already shown you pictures of the ship going into the ice, but sometimes we need to go further, and crashing through ice is a really carbon intensive process. So what we have now are underwater drones that can do a lot of this. And here's one. This is, I did promise you Boaty McBoatface, I think, at the start of the talk. This is what is really Boaty McBoatface. It's not the ship. We actually called this underwater drone, we call it the Auto Sub Long Range Boaty McBoatface. And what this does is it goes on missions for about maybe three or 4 weeks, where it can actually go around underneath ice, and it's got loads and loads of different sensors, just like a CTD. It can go through lots of conditions underneath the ice and make these measurements that are so desperately needed. And training these to do more and more ambitious missions now is becoming quite a major source of funding that we are requiring, and seem to be convincing people to give us, because actually this again is giving us data we didn't previously have in a more carbon friendly way. So that is a great innovation that actually has been pioneered very much in the UK, and that we are sort of branching out internationally to give other people capability to do these types of measurements. And this is a thing that we're aiming to do, to have these networks of underwater drones and gliders. Navigating under ice is really difficult for a drone. It doesn't quite know where it is because it can't go to the surface and then communicate with a satellite. So we have to set up listening, or what we call it acoustic navigation buoys underneath that are giving out signals, acoustic signals, sound signals, that these underwater drones can then just use to actually work out where they are and get more information from us to know what its next mission are. So these are, it looks quite space age. We're not far off doing this now. It's quite an expensive process, but again, it's getting us data. It's not used as much carbon, and it's basically the future of the type of science that needs to be done in order to get these really important measurements. But we don't just do it under the ice. We also have drones. There's a lot of drones in the news, I know, but they can be used for really productive purposes as well. And actually, where satellites can't go, quite often it's very cloudy in the polar regions. These sort of lower level drones can get lots and lots of really interesting data that we couldn't otherwise get. And we are now able possibly to use these types of drones, A, to look at the color of the ocean, but B, even to pick out things like zooplankton, krill, by looking at how orange the water is, because these are orange organisms. And doing those types of surveys again has given us fantastic insights that we couldn't get in any other way. And again, it's quite very low in terms of the amount of carbon that it needs to get those measurements. And the other thing we can do is that we can leave things there for longer term. So these are things called oceanographic moorings. We put it in, this one is in deep water in about 3,000 meters, and you can see the structure of it. There's a weight on the bottom. It has various sensors going all the way to about 100 meters below the surface. It doesn't go all the way to the surface because the ice would damage it, but it can get almost to the surface. What I want to pick out on this mooring here, the one that we use this, it's in the water now, collecting data, is that it has these yellow sort of triangle things called sediment traps. And those are really important to understanding what I referred to earlier as this carbon pump, this movement of carbon from the surface, from the phytoplankton, from the CO2 that came from the atmosphere originally, all the way to the deep ocean, trying to intercept that to look at the rate at which has been taken into the deep oceans. And these sediment traps are left there for about a year, and then we see the seasonal cycles of the carbon that they're collecting. So let's go back to our model again and just look at how we're understanding this system. We have the nutrients coming in with the ecosystem processes with those carbon pumps, and we're trying to measure those carbon pumps there with my improvised schematic of moorings. And then what happens next, we've looked at the deep oceans, is that quite a lot of the nutrients coming out of the Southern Ocean and the Arctic fuel a lot of the world's fisheries because there's tons of nutrients that are coming out of there. A lot of them are required in other parts of the ocean. They get carried around. And so understanding that process is a part of a project that I'm working on now called Biopole, of seeing what happens next beyond the poles, about how important they are to the rest of the global ocean. And these are some of the things that these amazing organisms do in the polar regions in terms of these carbon pumps I talked about. Krill, they are my favorite organism. They are enormously abundant. In fact, the biomass of krill is equal, if not greater, than the biomass of the whole human race. And they only occur in the Southern Ocean. They're just one species, so they are the most biomass-rich single species on Earth. But what they do is that they eat this phytoplankton at the surface. Either they migrate into the deeper layers or they poo a lot, basically. They get lots of carbon. They're in these very, very dense fecal pellets that sink into the deep ocean at amazing rates. And they do sequester a lot of carbon in that way. And there's other ways that it happens as well from these even tinier organisms called copepods that go on these massive journeys of 2,000 meters or so, possibly, where they spend the winter and then they take lots of carbon with them that they use for fuel. They breathe it out basically through their own respiration like we do. And they leave that carbon in the deep ocean. So these are the pumps that the biology can actually add to the physical mechanisms that can offset a lot of the carbon dioxide that we are at the moment as a human race pumping into our atmosphere. This biodiversity, these animals are not so easy to study with these methods that I talked about. We are developing new imaging methods, but some ways we still need to calibrate what we do with things that we can capture from the oceans. I'm just going to show you a process that I've been doing for most of my career, is putting a big net through the ocean and then analyzing it. I've just got a video here. There was no soundtrack to this one, so I'll just have to talk over it. So this is a rectangular midwater trawl that we would put to maybe 1,000 meters down in the ocean. Here's the technicians driving that net, monitoring where it is in the ocean. It takes about 4 hours, so it's already got dark by the time we got back. Pulling it back on. It's a bit of a manual exercise. It's good for your biceps, pulling that back onto the deck there. And then we brought this catch into the lab, and the eagle-eyed of you could see somebody looking really, really important with a green hoodie. That's me. I'm mostly the one doing no work whatsoever, just ordering everybody else what to do. I do sit at a microscope at some point and look through books. But what we're trying to do is actually categorize the biodiversity and look at the biomass of these animals to look at what they're doing in these really important biological carbon pumps. And we do this year in, year out. We have time series of how this has changed over time, what new things we didn't understand before, and document it in large data sets that we make openly available to everybody who would like to analyze it. Of course, we do a lot of analysis on it ourselves, documented that. That process there sped up, took about maybe 2.5 hours to process that catch. We might do that round the clock about 5 or 6 times each day and do it consistently for about 2 weeks or so. Like you see, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning when we finish there. And this is something I want to emphasize to you. I know it's a bit of fun, this, and unfortunately, you can't hear the really, really good music that we're dancing to, but it's all about teamwork. Nobody does this as an individual. Here is us next to one of those massive icebergs that I showed you earlier. This one was an A68. This was actually one that came across this year. This has happened about 6 months ago. And I thought, wouldn't it be great as a team that we all went onto the heli deck of the Sir David Attenborough and did a square dance to Ice Ice Baby. So you have to imagine the song of Ice Ice Baby as I show you us trying to strut our stuff. Or maybe you can hear it if you listen carefully. There we go. So that's an iceberg called A23 in the background there. The idiot with the really orange looking suit looks a bit like a Teletubby. That's me on the right hand side there. I've got my steps perfected like some people. There we go. But this is great for team spirit. You know, we have to work on these things really, really hard. It's been a difficult journey. This is almost like with a week to go to the end of the expedition, and we're just letting off a bit of steam. But this is what we have to do. You can definitely see there's some better dancers, and I'm not one of them. There we go. Right. So there we are. I've been on many expeditions. I've been with many fantastic teams, and we've made some really, really important measurements that we hope will help us as a human race understand what's happening to our planet and make better strategic decisions that we can collectively sign up to going forwards. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Geraint, thank you so much. I think there was enough for an entire degree for us to absorb then.
Right.
Maybe if you could just
I'm struggling with my let me get that. Okay. How do I stop sharing? Have I stopped sharing now?
Yes, please, if you could. Yeah.
I'm still sharing, am I? Oh, okay. Something's gone wrong with my computer, I'm afraid.
Maybe I can switch you off here. Oh no, that might be.
As far as I can see, I'm not sharing anymore, but you are seeing the end of my presentation. Is that right?
Yes.
We are seeing the I'm going to switch multiple sharing off, see if that disappears it, but no, it's not.
It's all gone really funny. I wonder if, oh, hang on. No.
It's normally at the top of the screen saying stop share.
I Zoom all the time. It's just something gone funny with my computer, so I can't see the sharing thing anymore. It's disappeared. Well, I don't know where it's gone.
While you're fiddling with that, thank you again.
I've got it. Sorry.
Oh, well done. Oh, very good. Very good. You should be pinpointed or highlighted there. Thank you so much. And as you can see, many appreciative comments there. That is so rich. I mean, where do we start? If anybody's got any questions or comments, please do. I can try and keep track of you if you raise your hand on screen, or else certainly write in the chat if you'd like. So we've got about 15 minutes or so. I just wanted to comment on how the breadth of kind of ways you go about it. I mean, it's extraordinary to see someone with a clipboard, you know, in this age of drones and undersea robots and all of the rest. So it's a really human endeavor, isn't it? And I suppose I just wanted to pitch in there a question about do you experience us lay people as caring enough, as knowing enough, as getting involved enough, and if we don't, what is it that we can do to become more aware and care for perhaps the polar oceans in the way that we might for pandas?
What a great question. If I'm honest, we see it almost the other way around, that we're not doing enough to communicate what we are trying to do. I enjoy talking to people like you, and that people are interested, but it's reaching beyond people like you as well about some of the importance of these things that we really need to care about if we care about our planet and climate. It's not easy communicating. We have actually a dedicated team in the British Antarctic Survey that actually their job is to try and communicate what we are doing in ways that people can understand as well. Science can be complicated necessarily because these are complex things that we're trying to understand. But actually, the concepts behind them can be communicated very clearly with people who are good at science communication. When I think about some of the complex things that, some of my heroes like Brian Cox, for instance, he's trying to explain the universe in very, layman's terms that we can grab hold of. And he's just a great example that, we would try and use that type of approach to get some of these concepts through to people that, might just think, oh, well, that's just too complicated for me to understand that. It really isn't, as long as it's explained properly. And I think that we really need feedback as well about how we can do our job better. So I don't think we ever see it that people like you are not doing enough, but far from it is that we're not communicating our message in a way that's fully coherent and makes sense.
Something for both of us, both sides there. Wilson, you've got your hand up.
Thanks. Hi, Professor Tarling. I just wanted to ask you about the kind of polar ocean currents that you talked about, moving energy, nutrients, carbon. Is there any evidence that maybe, global warming is affecting the strength, speed, direction, of this conveyor belt?
Yes.
Should we be afraid?
In a word, it's a very hard process to measure. I think that's the first thing to say about that. It's incredibly variable. The measurements are not easily made, especially of these deeper currents. There's something that's come out of a project that's been led by the British Antarctic Survey, not in terms of the current speed, but in terms of the strength and sorry, I'll get my words right here, the temperature of these deeper currents. Now, these are really stable currents that alter by minuscule amounts, and the variability is very small, but they have seen a trend of these currents getting warmer. So what that does is that it reduces the gradient that would actually drive that current. So one of the ultimate things that would happen then is that the current would slow down because the gradient is less strong going from the cold to the warm. There's also been, maybe not in the Antarctic, but there's been a lot more monitoring of the Gulf Stream coming across from the Caribbean to the UK and beyond onto Norway. And that part of the ocean conveyor, of course, matters to us. And there's been a lot of research into it because that ocean conveyor, that part of the ocean conveyor is what makes us a relatively temperate and favorable environment to live in. If you were actually on the east coast of Canada at the same latitude as us, you would find that the summers are incredibly warm and the winters are about -10 to -15. And that's exactly the same latitude of the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. That's what the ocean conveyor does for us. And if that does slow down, it means that the heat isn't being transported to Western Europe as much. And so there has been some evidence, it has been hotly contested, that might be slowing down. And so it does go sometimes through a lot of number crunching, a lot of modeling to decide, because it's such a difficult process to measure. But just to answer the question more succinctly, if the deep oceans are warming, then that means ultimately that conveyor will slow down. So that's what we're worrying about.
Yes. Good practical question here from Jonathan. He's wondering how often you lose the moored sensor stacks whales, storms.
Yeah, this is the thing that keeps me up at night. And what we have are satellite sensors on there because, as I said, they are not at the ocean surface. We don't communicate with them all the time because we have to keep them below the ice. But if they do get knocked by, just passing icebergs, that sort of thing, or if they even get knocked by vessels that just don't know they're there, then they come to the surface and tell us where they are and say, look, I've come loose. Please come and pick me up. And quite often we can rescue them that way and get most of our equipment back. But it means that we've lost the measurements because it's not measuring anymore. We've got what it had. So up to the point when it was knocked. I mean, those moorings themselves cost about £2.5 million, and so it's quite a major capital investment to lose. So we put as many bells and whistles on it as possible to make sure that if they do come loose, we have a way of retrieving them, and we will mobilize whatever ships are in the vicinity to try and get them back, because even the data they've collected to that point is really vital. There was when I was talking about that iceberg that you saw right at the end there, where we were dancing in front of it, that iceberg went right over the top almost of one of our moorings, and we were so worried about it, we actually diverted the ship to take the mooring out of the way, even though it was 200 meters deep. That iceberg was so deep below the water, it was a danger it might have got knocked. So we actually took evasive action in that particular instance. But yeah, it is something that we do lose. It is quite a blow. It's almost like one of those sort of moments where they ring the bell in Lloyd's, the insurance firm, because you've lost something. If we do lose one of those moorings, it is quite a blow for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Audrey, hand up.
Yeah. Thank you for your passion in it. It's really engaging. I think I've got myself confused. I thought part of life required sunlight. And so the deeper you go down, you won't get the sunlight. And also when you're talking about phytoplankton and chlorophyll, surely to do photosynthesis, an integral part is the sun.
So you're quite right. Phytoplankton do need sun to grow. So what happens when these organisms live for about 2 or 3 months at most, maybe shorter? And what happens next is that they senesce, they die. Most of them are negatively buoyant, they sink. And so when we're talking about all that carbon that they've trapped to build their body doesn't disappear, it still stays in their corpse, as it were, and then sinks through the ocean. So these are dead organisms that are sinking down. And quite a lot of that, dead matter is intercepted before it gets to the deeper parts of the ocean. But what can happen when I talk about the biology getting involved is that all that sort of phytoplankton is eaten at the surface and actually fast tracked into the deep ocean through these organisms, either packaging them up into fecal pellets, the poo that sinks really quickly, or they actually migrate down there themselves and then take that carbon that they've eaten at the surface into the deep ocean. So you're quite right to qualify that. A really good question. So all that capture of the carbon by the photosynthesis itself just happens in the euphotic layer, the layer that's lit by the sunlight, which maybe depends on how much attenuation, how much of that sunlight's absorbed, depending on how much matter. If I go to the Severn Estuary, for instance, the attenuation of light is only a couple of meters. Or if you go to the Southern Ocean, light can get to about 30 or 40 meters down. So you can get photosynthesis that deep. But beyond that, you're quite right, there's no photosynthesis. So it's just the dead organisms going into the deep ocean.
That surface layer is incredibly dynamic, isn't it? Between water and atmosphere.
It is, and some people that's all they do. That's all their science is, looking at that interface between the air and the sea.
Yeah. Question here from Lucy on how can lay people be communicated with in a way? So you touched on that makes us act, and specifically, Lucy says there are poets, musicians, and artists on this call. So what role is there for poetry, art, and music in this kind of public communication?
There's a role for all of them. And we try and communicate through every possible means. In fact, we had, we didn't have a poet with us on that last expedition, but we made poetry a theme of our expedition where we never had team meetings. We actually would read poems to each other and talk about how influential they are, either conveying human emotions or actually conveying the natural world as well. And there were some great examples that we recited to each other, just showing how powerful a medium it is. We've definitely collaborated with sculpture people as well, and other types of artists, try and communicate some of the concepts of climate change, the ways of trying to convey that in other ways that people might communicate and connect with. So there's a role for all aspects of communication and appreciation to try and get these messages across about how to care for our planet and to understand the processes going on. And we have a number of programs, in fact, in the British Antarctic Survey trying to reach out in that way. And in fact, there is somebody coming to our organization this week talking about some poems that they made called Fire and Ice, about the processes of climate change and other dynamic processes happening in the polar region. So yes, it's we encourage all of that as much as we possibly can and try and help and inspire people and communicate with them.
I know there's a whole discipline called geopoetics now, which comes out of Scotland, of course, where geology was invented. Perhaps we need a kind of Antarctic poetics as well.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Antarctic Poet Society. Yeah, I'd definitely join
Absolutely.
that.
The penguins could join. Susie says, have the densities of krill been measured, which I think is what you're doing, but can you say anything about declines in the as the pH has changed?
Yes. So for pH, where we found the greatest effects on Antarctic krill was on the very, very young stages. There's a fantastic scientist that I'm in complete awe of, who's based in Australia, called So Kawaguchi, and he incubated krill. One of the only people ever to get krill through a whole life cycle, in fact, but he incubated the eggs and then exposed them to different levels of pH and found that they just didn't develop properly in those very, very young stages when they were exposed to levels of pH that might exist in a few decades' time. So that's the threat to krill, particularly because those eggs go really deep down in the ocean. They have a very strange life cycle where they lay their eggs and then they sink to about 1,000 meters. And then they have so much fat, they have so much reserve in them, they can swim all the way back to the surface again without eating. And these are tiny things, and you can imagine that journey of them for them would be like us traversing the whole of the UK, and they're doing that as these sort of very, very small larvae. And that is quite a sort of a sobering message that they can't get through those young parts of their life cycle, and they're just not going to make it to many other parts as well. So that was a very sobering study that they did there, and we can only hope that we just don't go down to those levels of pH that were affecting those organisms.
I didn't realize there was this single species of krill. I thought it was a whole mass of that. Does that make them more vulnerable?
Both of those things are correct. So krill is quite often a shorthand term for one particular species called Euphorsia superba. But there are 85, I think, other species of euphorsids, so the other relatives to Euphorsia superba in that taxa, of which I think 13 are in the Southern Ocean and the rest are distributed all the way around the rest of the globe. A lot of them are very small compared to krill. So krill is quite large, actually. I used to have a little sort of, have I got one here? Must have lost it. Anyway, I have my token krill. Maybe I'll find it at some point. But a krill are about that big. They are quite large, actually. People think that they're tiny. They're not. They actually are. They are small shrimps. But some of these other species, they're much smaller than that. They're about that big. So yeah, it does make them vulnerable because it is a single species. They also are very interesting and they have one of the largest genomes that's ever been discovered in any organism. And so we don't quite know why that is, but it potentially could give them some adaptive potential, a little bit more than I was sort of explaining, is capable of other polar organisms. This one might be more adaptable, particularly to these changes in temperature than we might think. A lot of my work has been on how adaptive they are, and we've seen that they have incredible capacity to adapt to warmer temperatures, at least around South Georgia, for instance. So it's not all bleak. In terms of the answer about are they declining? I've got another collaborator in Plymouth, his name is Angus Atkinson, who published a study in Nature about 16 years ago now, showing for the first time that the population has declined since the 1920s. From then on, we haven't seen dramatic declines. It does oscillate. It's one of these signals that's really hard to measure. But at the moment, we think the populations are relatively stable, whether it's a hiatus or there's another phase of decline for them. But they definitely were more abundant in the 1920s and 1930s than they are now.
Those knock-on effects to our fisheries, of course.
There is a fishery for krill, and it's one of the things that part of my team do is go to a regular, in fact, they're there now as I speak, in Hobart, where they have an annual international meeting where they talk about the regulation of harvesting resources in the Southern Ocean, because you can harvest. It's very tightly managed. It's managed by a body called CANMAR. It's the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And the principle of it is that you can only harvest as long as you can demonstrate it has no impact on the rest of the ecosystem. It's the only fishery in the world that demands that. And they have very tight regulations to ensure that when things are harvested, it has no other impacts. Of course, there's a lot of lobbies that will dispute that. But when you think about the biomass of krill being about 200 million tons, now we're taking, at the moment, the fishery can take about 600,000 tons. So a very tiny amount of the total biomass is allowed to be fished at the moment. We just hope that we can keep those regulations in place, because there's a lot of other international lobbies trying to get those quotas to be lifted.
Thank you so much again, Geraint. It's just fantastic, and we really, really appreciate you being here with us all. Is there any last moment questions?
Well, it would only be going on from the krill. Is that source of omega-3 that we see in pills and things, and food, dog food and whatever?
Yeah, so what's happened to the krill industry is that it used to be harvested a lot by the Russians before the Soviet era ended, and then the fishery collapsed for them because it was very heavily subsidized fishery then, and it wasn't used for anything sophisticated at all. It just went into meal and sort of very low quality products. And then it was discovered, as you just mentioned, about the omega-3 fatty acid properties, and the fact that that's believed to be very beneficial for health benefits for humans. And so the price of krill went up dramatically. But it has to be processed in a particular way. Krill goes off. It has particular enzymes in it, and unless you process it immediately, I mean, absolutely at the moment that it comes out of the sea, then a lot of those properties, the omega-3 fatty acids, degrade. And so there's quite sophisticated ships go down now. They were developed by the Norwegians. I think the Chinese now have that same technology, where they can actually harvest a lot of these very high value chemicals out of krill that they then put onto these nutraceutical markets and make a lot of money from that. So that's transformed the demand for krill from one that was just a low value product where the margins were very small, to one now where a lot of people are getting interested because they can make a lot of money from it.
The first time I've heard that word, nutraceutical.
Nutraceuticals, yeah.
Nutraceuticals. Last question to Johnny.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I know you've touched on a lot of the issues, but I did wonder if you sort of met a awkward customer at a dinner party, a sort of Jeremy Clarkson climate change denier, and they said, "Why are you going out into the ocean in this boat and spending all this money?" I wondered if you had like a concise elevator pitch type reply to someone who might ask that question.
Yeah, I do get people like that. In fact, I've just come from a conference in the Royal Society where it wasn't someone like that, but someone who was talking about interactions that they're having. It's a cross-party minister called George Freeman. And he was part of the one of the previous Victoria administrations. He's still in government now in Norfolk. And he was saying, well, how do I go and sell this back to my constituency who are on the verge of going to reform? And reform voters, I don't want to sort of completely paint them with one brush, but a lot of them are not interested, in fact, anti-climate. And he was saying that one of the strongest arguments he has for them is that one of the consequences of global warming, of course, is the fact that sea levels are going to rise. And his constituency is in a very low-lying area in North Norfolk. So he looked at some of these projections that we had at the Royal Society meeting and saw that actually half of the constituency, if some of these ice shelves melted, would be underwater. So one of his sells to the constituency, he says, and to the reform voters there, is that actually if you keep going the way you are, your house will be underwater within the end of the century. So, there's some arguments they get through. Others, they just say, well, what the hell? It doesn't make any difference to me. I just want to keep living my lifestyle. But you have to think, you got to keep being consistent with the message. I think it's very disappointing sometimes when you're seeing some policies coming out to trying to reject sort of some of the hard decisions that have to be made over climate change. And I do get quite disappointed when I see that, because we've worked so hard at making the argument to the people who make policy. There's some people out there, you're never going to change their mind. That's it. It's gone. But actually, you have to work around that and actually get to the people who make the decisions about how we try and live as a society, because that's where it really matters. And making it laws and putting them into place and seeing them through and having the conviction to see them through, even when the politics is not easy. That's where, you know, you have to keep making the argument time and time again, just to show the projections, show what will happen as a consequence of doing some of the things that we're doing to the planet now. Because if we step back from that, then, you know, a lot of those things are going to come true. And that's definitely what we want to avoid. I don't want to leave on a bad news story. I just want to leave on a good news story. If you remember back to those SSPs, those socioeconomic pathways I was showing you, some of those upper projections, as a result of some of the things that we've already done as a worldwide community, those are already have been avoided because of what we've done already. And actually, we just need to keep working to make sure that we keep ticking all those worst case scenarios off, because we are making the right decisions in the way that we're treating our planet and using the resources of the planet. And that's basically, it's just going to keep going. You know, we just have to keep at it. And it'll be difficult times, but you just have to remain consistent to the message.
Firstly, thank you so much for your positivity throughout, Geraint. And in this week, when the world as a whole, for the first time, has generated more electricity from renewables than from coal, it's you know, we can hold on to that sort of hope, can't we?
It's a good win, isn't it? It's the thing that you can throw back at each people and just say, well, actually, other nations are doing it better than us as well, you know. And it's a competition in some ways, but the right type of competition to be on the right side of that argument.
Fantastic. I think probably a good place to leave it. Petra, would you mind hitting stop record?
I am stopping it and hoping you won't
I won't.